But on that, like, I'm curious, since we have you on the program, Paul, I mean, to talk a little bit about some of the things that have been happening recently. I mean, like, there's been some really exciting, I think, developments in the labor movement in this country. Last week, we had a guest on. We were talking about some of the stuff that was happening in the UAW. Teamsters are on a similar track. I feel really bad. I don't have the the video of the Teamster president at Congress,
Right. Yeah.
slapping around the senator from Oklahoma. I'm forgetting his name right now.
By the way, members, I'm sorry to butt in real quick, but
Yeah.
members love that video. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the guy in Britain, UK, the union leader,
Nick Lynch, yeah.
And since I saw Amina in the chat, I'll shout her out because I mean she's talked about this too, about like we need more union leaders that are combative, and like again, the members love it. I mean, they're all sending that video around like constantly. So anyway, just want to interject there.
No, I mean, I think that's like a huge point. I mean, like, this is what's so exciting. It's like, I mean, totally. I think that it's important to be more combative, but like the nice thing too is like it's also met with a bit of substance. And we open up the show. I'm just going to play it because it's fun. I don't mind watching it again. This quick video of Sean Fain, the new president of the UAW, and like everything about this, I love both the message, but also the music. Because I think this comes from the UAW's social media account too. They added some badass guitars into the background, which I think we need much more of that. But let me just play that for a second and hear your take.
But the UAW wasn't founded by asking for permission. The founders of this union didn't wait for the law. They didn't worry about the law. They wanted their dignity and they wanted their fair share, and they did what the hell they had to do to get it. The companies we deal with do not feel bound by the law. Ask a Starbucks worker who's been fired for organizing. Ask a Volkswagen worker in Tennessee whose boss threatened to close the plant if they unionized. Employers don't give a damn about breaking the law if it serves their interest. We've got to aspire to the spirit of our union's founders and the sit-down strikers and the civil rights movement. They knew there's no law that can hold back a united working class. There are no words on paper that will stand in the way of our fight for justice on or off the job.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And I got to say, I love the editing there so much. But I mean, like, I think this is such an important point to make. And like, it's certainly true in the labor struggle. I think it's also true in the political struggle. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about how I'm very thankful to hear AOC, for example, saying that like, hey, it's probably time that we start pushing back against the courts if they're going to try to curtail all of our rights. But I mean, like, Paul, I mean, I know this is like a broad question, but take it in a direction that you want. I mean, like, as somebody, inside of these things, I mean, like, do you have a sense that like there might be a kind of change in a sense of like more militancy, more willingness to come up against the bosses, more willingness to like take on this kind of rhetoric when it comes to how working class people can and should fight against the overreach of capitalists and bosses?
Yeah. And, first I'll say like, with speech there, it's not just like good rhetoric. I mean, that it's actually objectively true and good history. I mean, the unions that we know of today were literally built from breaking the law, and not just, industrial unions. In the 1960s, there was a wave of public sector struggles that formed the public sector unions we know today, of teachers, sanitation, down the list. And in almost every single case, it was a law that public sector workers couldn't strike and couldn't form a union. And they just struck anyway. And then the law was like, okay, I guess you can strike and form a union, So, I don't want to be too flippant about it. It's easier said than done. And usually these things happen in kind of a wave where more and more people feel emboldened. But it's just true that like there has to be a point where you're willing to kind of buck the law, but you just have to have enough mass support to do it. But I do think something is changing. I mean, the two biggest stories recently in the Teamsters and United Auto Workers, massive, two still very big industrial unions. So, with the UAW, a huge sea change just happened. The Reform Caucus, United Auto Workers for Democracy, UAWD, just won total control of the union. So people like Sean Fain and others who are willing to fight, be more combative, and honestly, I'll say this openly because the organizers have also said this openly. When UAWD ran a slate, their perspective was like, if we win like 2 seats on the board, that's a victory. They had no inkling that they would just win control, and I think it's a combination, I think, of some short-term factors and long-term trends. The long-term trend is that it's just been for decades now, concession after concession in the auto industry. Loss of jobs, creation of two-tier, where you have workers doing the same work as other workers getting paid on a different wage scale. So just all these concessions for forever. And then also most recently, there was a huge corruption scandal in the UAW that got exposed. And I think that was sort of the final straw. So you have that happening in the UAW, in 2021 in the Teamsters union, the Teamsters United slate, which, Teamsters for a Democratic Union was a part of, won against the former Hoffa forces. Before that, Jimmy Hoffa Jr. was in charge of the union. And again, a combination, I think, of long-term trends where concession after concession over years. In 2018, the reform slate lost by a very, very small margin, which showed that there was gaining momentum. The last contract at UPS in 2018, a huge concession was made where two-tier was essentially allowed into the contract for the first time, and so this new election was a kind of reaction to that. And these leaders are being elected on the basis of being more militant, being more confrontational. We're already seeing it in the Teamsters. Most recently, Cisco, which is a grocery store company. There's been coordinated strike action, from Kentucky, Indianapolis, California, and that wasn't happening previously, and they've won better contracts because of that. We, of course, have the UPS contract coming up in August, and also with the auto workers union, the what are called the big three automakers, so GM, Ford, and Chrysler, which apparently now is called something else, Stellantis or something.
Yeah, I can't remember. Yeah.
So those contracts are up in the fall. I wouldn't go as far as to say like, okay, now everyone is ready to just like break every law there is. Unfortunately, at least, unlike the railway situation, Congress cannot force workers back to work in stuff like UPS and the auto workers. But I do think there is this growing sense of militancy and people being fed up. I do feel this broadly from people I work with in my own work that like there's only so much more we can keep conceding before what's the point. So I think there is this kind of, people are responding to this message of fighting back. It's hard to ignore. I mean, not only have this been happening for a long time, but when you add in the most recent struggles with inflation on top of it, it's like something has to give at some point. So I don't want to get too excited too quickly, but I think this summer and fall with UPS and the auto companies are going to be really.
Could you talk? Could you talk a little bit more about this UPS movement for
Yeah,
folks who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah. So I mean, one thing off the bat, Teamsters represent over 340,000 workers at UPS. So that is the biggest union contract in the country. And I think also what's powerful about it, it's a truly national contract. So UPS, whether it's Manhattan or a small town in Idaho or Montana, UPS has a presence, and there are UPS workers everywhere. So, having a fight like that or a strike like that, really touches the entire country. It's obvious how important UPS is economically. 5% of the country's GDP is moved by UPS every single day.
Wow.
And you can imagine, since COVID, we all are just sitting home ordering stuff. We've been sitting home ordering stuff. So that's only been increasing the importance of UPS to the economy. So I think it's going to be a big fight that will also kind of make waves throughout the labor movement, throughout the logistics industry. I think Amazon workers are going to be watching this fight to see what happens. And I think it's a key UPS. Like I said, in the last contract, 2 wages were introduced, so that the president has made very clear that's a strike issue. We need to get rid of two-tier. But also, I think
Mhm.
people should realize, when we think about UPS, we're probably thinking about the drivers, we see delivering packages, but the majority of UPS workers are part-time workers who work inside warehouses, who sort packages and load them on the trucks. That's actually the majority of the workforce. And they, don't even make living wage in most cases. Also, a lot of them would like to be full-time warehouse employees, and the company keeps them part-time on purpose. So I think that's going to be really key, is making these living wage jobs for the part-timers who are the majority, creating more full-time jobs. In the 1997 UPS strike, the slogan was "Part-time America won't work," and they created
Mm.
a lot more full-time jobs out of that. And they also had broad public support throughout. One thing I've kind of realized more and more, I mean, it should have been obvious, is we think about positions like teachers and nurses that seem to kind of be better placed to have public support. But you think about the UPS drivers. I mean, they have a route. They really know the people well
Yeah.
that they deliver to, and
Mhm.
the small businesses. They're actually very popular figures. They were in 1997. I think they will be this time around. So yeah, I mean, this is going to be a big fight, and again, I think it's important not just for those UPS workers, but I think it could be like a big shot in the arm to the entire labor movement. I think again, the auto workers can look at this and be inspired if the outcome is good. There's also some good, speaking of Mizaki and just transition, there's some good kind of cross pollination happening. Right now UPS wants to shift to electric vehicles, but they're
Mm.
using non-union labor. And now,
Mm.
Teamsters want to look at collaborating with this new UAW leadership to force UPS
Fuck
to
yeah.
use, union labor on these electric vehicles. So, a lot of opportunities I think are starting to open up.
I mean, it's truly exciting. I mean, in a lot of ways, like some of the more militancy and like willingness to fight back is more exciting than some aspects of, for example, maybe like the 2020 Bernie campaign for me. But like, this is like a broader question, Paul. But like, I think, um, and we posed it last week to our guest, but I wanted to ask you, because like I think sometimes people have hesitation or anxiety or a difficulty knowing, particularly if you're outside, if you're just like a leftist, right? Knowing how to support and how to talk about these fights, right? Because like basically what's happening in the UAW, what's happening in the Teamsters is like these are like unions that are becoming more democratic, right? That are listening more and more to their rank and file, that are opening it up, and that means that these fights are happening for a lot of lefties, I think, because they see how much on the back foot the union movement is. They're a little timid sometimes about talking about, oh, we need more democratization, we need more rank and file leadership. I mean, like, how do you walk that line as an advocate for labor and labor unions, and also somebody who wants to see these things develop, in maybe a somewhat of a different way than they maybe had over the past 20, 30 years. I'm just curious, like, if you have any sense of advice or orientation that people should have when they're thinking about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in terms of an orientation, and in terms of understanding, because I get it, it is in a sense like inside baseball, internal union
Hmm.
fights. I imagine it's harder to understand, like if you're not in that particular union or in a union in general. I mean, I think resources like Labor Notes, labornotes.org, they do stories. I mean, this is basically what they cover, is like,
Hmm.
the internal union struggles for democracy, democratization and all that. I mean, I recommend people following them. And yeah, I mean, orienting towards it, it is tough because I think, if you are an outsider in a sense of like not a member of a particular union, it's not necessarily that helpful to be kind of criticizing for the outside, or, but I think in terms of like, whether it's podcasts like this or other things like, trying to bring on, whether it's workers who are involved in that kind of movement, themselves to talk about it. And I think in terms of an organizing thing, you know, I'm just going to use DSA as an example, like a DSA chapter. I actually think, as much as I am kind of see myself as a part of this kind of sort of internal union reform effort, and I was, when I was a teacher in my union, it's sort of, again, you don't really have much control over it if you're not in a union. So I think, like,
Hmm.
if you're a group like DSA chapter, I mean, you should really just try to work with the union that is there and whatever leadership exists to what you can, because, and just realize, like, you really won't be determining the fate. That's going to have to come internally from workers, which can be a difficult, balance maybe to strike sometimes. But I think it's just realizing that ultimately it's going to have to be the workers themselves in these unions who are going to try to make some kind of change. It can't really come from the outside.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well put. Well, Paul, will you keep us up to date with everything that's happening with the Teamsters over the next couple months? We'd love to have you back on to talk about that. And
Oh
folks, if
yeah,
you're not already following
absolutely.
Paul, there's ways to follow him on Twitter below. People should also read Paul. Paul put out a great piece recently. Jacobin, no, the GI Bill did not make racial inequality worse. That I think is really important,
A very
actually.
subtle title.
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, look, I think it's important to push back. Like, there's a certain part of the liberal ruling class that loves to wage war on good government policy.
Well, what was it Hillary said? Ending too big to fail won't cure racism or something like
Breaking up
that,
the
Yeah.
banks.
or breaking up the
Yeah.
banks. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
mean, as Paul said, forming a union can go some way towards that. So there you go.
But people should definitely read that piece and all of Paul's work. And again, friend, thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.